So, what's trending? Bridging your Catholic faith with your everyday life. You're listening to Trending with Timmerie on Relevant Radio.
Welcome to Trending. Coming up, we have two incredible feast days this weekend. One is the feast of St. Maximilian Kolbe. Look at this. We have two saints within 1 week. St. Edith Stein on Monday and Saturday, tomorrow, the 14th, St. Maximilian Kolbe. They're feast days, both of which these two saints lived during World War II, died at relatively young ages, and they died at Auschwitz. Incredible stories. We'll talk a little bit about St. Maximilian Kolbe, but also Sunday is the feast day of the Assumption of the Blessed Virgin Mary. Now, I must say that this feast day has always caught my attention in a particularly special way. The reason for that is because it's only been a little more than 100 years that this feast day has actually been a part of the official tradition and teaching of the church. Prior to that, it was a living tradition depicted in art and in the centuries passed down by the people of faith. It was celebrated, but it wasn't fully acknowledged by the Pope, by the church. Why is that? We'll discuss that and the significance of recognizing the Assumption more recently here on Trending, and what you can do to turn to Our Lady over these next few days to maybe consecrate yourself to her or celebrate her in a particularly special way. You're listening to Trending with Timmerie. Coming up will be Dr. Susan Caldwell. She's a NaPro doctor, which is a fertility specialist, also addressing infertility, irregularities, regularities of cycle. And gentlemen, don't go away. This is an incredible resource for you, a loved one. We're going to talk about everything from being premenopausal to whether or not ovarian cysts are really a big deal. And we'll also touch on your questions surrounding fertility and infertility. So if you have a question, the number's 1-888-914-9149, or you can go ahead and head over to my Instagram. Follow me at Timmerie, Timmerie, where you can ask your question anonymously or not, and we will go ahead and ask that question, Dr. Caldwell, here during the live hour. Just, again, ask your question live on my Instagram. I put a question box up for you to drop that question in. So many are preparing to go to college for the first time perhaps this fall, or in light of everything that's happened over the last year and a half now with COVID, maybe you're going back to online Zoom college. You're feeling frustrated, unsure. Maybe you have a child who over the next couple of years will be approaching a college education, and it's time to start discerning. I'll never forget, a few years ago, there was an article that came out on the Daily Signal, and we continue to see things such as this coming out from everywhere, from Business Insider to Forbes, begging the question of whether or not a college education is worth it. Now listen to this, and it's actually only gotten worse since then. There's research done in 2012 that showed that we had 115 janitors, 16,000 parking lot attendants, 83,000 bartenders, and about 35,000 taxi drivers, all of whom have bachelor's degrees. That was as of 2012. We know that these numbers have only increased, and don't just count the janitors, the parking lot attendants, the bartenders, and the taxi drivers, but also include those who are waitressing and bussing at restaurants. Include those who are choosing to drive Uber and Lyft. You name it. There's so many things, I guess we could say, that people are doing today that their college education, they didn't need for it, or really has nothing to do with what they're doing. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm all for education. I think it's very important. I also recognize you may study one thing and it be completely unrelated to what you end up doing with work, but in some ways, what you studied actually is helpful for what you end up doing. But there's a trend happening right now, and it has to do with a decline in academic standards. You see, I think that this whole gap in terms of improper work for the level of education doesn't just have to do with lack of jobs, but it also has to do with declining academia. Standards have fallen. Grade inflation tends to, over and over again, lead people to test into university or finish their university time with a pretty decent grade at times. And it gives the wrong perception, yet employers aren't fooled by it. In fact, employers have recognized that many people trying to find a job have A, no experience, or B, when they're interviewing them, don't know how to interview and don't do a very good job and therefore don't get a job. You know, it's fascinating because we even see in community colleges that we found a very, very high rate of people having to take remedial studies. You see, 1 in 4 students who took the ACT in 2012, and again, numbers are just getting worse since then, in 2012, they met test readiness benchmarks. They failed to in all 4 subjects: English, reading, math, and science. You know, this is what's fascinating. Only 1 in 4 students who took the ACT in 2012 actually met those 4 benchmarks of standards. Now, I will give a caveat because I'm a really bad tester. I don't think I did very well on the ACT or SAT, whichever one I did. I think I did the SAT. I'm a bad tester. I don't think I did that great. I don't think that this should be the only way we are determining whether or not someone goes to school or gets a full ride. Some people are great testers. Some people are sponges when it comes to knowledge. I am neither of those two things. And so we shouldn't, again, set this on that standard. But here's the reality. There is a huge gap in terms of education, and proper education fitting the jobs that are being sought out. And there's something going on here that should lead all of us, whether you are a college student or have a child who's college bound one day, to reconsider the conversation and not be pressured by the way of the world in terms of being in the college way. You see, businesses are admitting that colleges, in and of themselves, aren't preparing students to be ready for the work environment. Let's look, for example, in New York University professor Richard Aram. He's a co-author of Academically Adrift: Limited Learning on College Campuses. And he says his study shows basically no improvements when it's come to critical thinking skills after 4 years at a university. Let's think about this. Employers are actually mentioning embarrassing emails for their company that are being written by their employees. Don't get me wrong, we can all put an occasional typo, especially with our speed writing and with Surrey that we tend to use too much. You know, I always think sometimes someone's talking to me and instead they're talking to Surrey to send a text message or an email. It used to be Bluetooth like 15, 20 years ago. You're like, oh, excuse me, like, are you talking to me? I'm responding. But then the person was on Bluetooth, and now it's that you're talking to Surrey. So here's the reality. It's not just that employers are complaining that embarrassing emails are being sent both internally and externally by employees who have a so-called university degree, but there's also a lack of confidence or an overcompensation in confidence from essentially employees who don't have enough experience, practice, practical skills when it comes to working in professional environments. Also, business professionals have commented that many young people who are coming out of university, entering into the workforce, have been coddled. And have been coddled for too long, not expected to be on their own 2 feet, to admit mistakes, to not be prideful, or to just say, hey, I don't know how to do this. That same author of Academically Adrift, Richard Aram, commented that in 1970, only 11% of adults in America held college degrees. However, and again, I'll just emphasize that, barely 1 out of 10 adults in 1970 had a college degree. Now, these degree holders, he said, were viewed as the nation's best and brightest. Today, Over 32%, that's 3 out of 10 adults, have a university degree, and that number is only going up year to year. But the difference is that we don't look at those who are graduating from university, those who claim a degree. We don't view them as the nation's best and brightest. You see, there's a significant portion, essentially, of people today that have lost the smarts of before, who have lost the discipline. So here's what it all comes down to as we start to ponder this. One more thing to just ponder. In 2017, 1 in 3 graduates held historically held jobs that essentially someone with a high school diploma would have held back in the 1970s. So 1 out of 3 people who have a college degree are holding jobs that people with high school diplomas held. So what are my takeaways? It's not to make us feel lousy about improper education or the job market, but I think that first we have to recognize that God does call us to work. In Genesis chapter 2, verse 15, we're called to till and keep the earth, to care and cultivate land, to care and cultivate what God has given us, to take responsibility, to provide a means for ourselves and our families. Genesis chapter 1, verses 26 through 28, we read about how God created us. And he created us to subdue the earth and have dominion. So for the earth to be subject to us, to fulfill our needs. But I think that there's something going on where we're losing this balance. We're over-preparing, under-preparing, or improperly preparing to work in the world today. Someone recently commented to me, and I've heard this over and over again. My sons could never go to college. Nope, they work with their hands. They would fail college. They would balk at the idea of college. No way, not for them. They refuse to go. They're working. They've been working since they were about 18. They work with their hands. They make a great living. And this is something that a lot of people are embarrassed to say. But this woman, this mom of 2 adult sons, was confident and proud. You see, there's no shame in learning a trade. Whether it's carpentry, plumbing, excavation, mechanics, any type of certification, heck, even cybersecurity, you don't necessarily have to have a degree for, or even IT work. I myself went to university, have a master's degree, but I also went ahead and went through a certification process because I knew what I studied, theology, communications, biblical theology, wasn't necessarily going to pay the bill. So I myself recognized I needed a sort of trade to help support myself. So I went and got my Pilates certification, went through all the education, the training, the courses, and that's how for a number of years I supported myself as a missionary doing pro-life Catholic work. I say that because the reality is a lot of people are having to go out and do additional certification programs or learn a trade because they found the college degree didn't work for them, or they felt pressured to finish the degree when they knew it wasn't right. So I encourage you as a parent, don't be too proud to think that your kid has to go to college. And if you're struggling trying to figure out what to do, or maybe you even do have a college education, but it's not fitting, don't be afraid to go out and start practicing that trade. Again, the question at hand, is college education worth it? I think the answer is not for everyone, but we need to allow that to actually be a conversation that's okay to have and not make people feel bad for having it. You're listening to Trending with Timmerie here on Relevant Radio. Joining me now is Dr. Susan Caldwell. She is a NaPro doctor who works and specializes with fertility and infertility. We're going to dive into the topics of ovarian cyst myths. Maybe you or someone you know has been afraid because they've been diagnosed with one. They are told they have to do something drastic. We'll discuss what to do. And also, we're going to dive now into the topic of menopause, pre-menopause, entering into that transition. Dr. Susan Caldwell, welcome to Trending.
Hi, Timmerie. So glad to be with you tonight.
Can we dive in while you're with us? Because you guys have so many resources. Check her out, drsusancaldwell.com. You have incredible blogs. One topic that we've been wanting to dive into, we talk a lot about fertility and infertility, but can you start to talk about some of the signs, good, bad, and what's happening with your hormones during that menopause transition into menopause?
Yes, I would love to. So menopause, perimenopause. So it's really we're talking about those 10 years before the last period. It's been called the second puberty because it's really puberty in reverse. So the first 10 years of a woman's reproductive life, her ovaries and brain are kind of learning how to communicate, and those ovaries are learning how to respond to the hormones from the brain. And that eventually, in 7 to 10 years results in these normal, healthy, regular cycles, or it's supposed to. But where women in their 40s often recognize is, wow, there are some strange things happening. And many of those women will go to their doctor and say, my periods are irregular. My periods are heavy. This is happening. This is happening. But often I don't think that women are educated as to what is normal and what really needs to be treated. So I think it's an important topic.
So what are some of the warning signs that something's off during this transition into menopause? So many people talk about, oh man, my mom's going through menopause. She's a real fill in the blank. Yes. What are signs for recognizing that in yourself and others? And is that pre-menopause or is that menopause itself?
Yes. So menopause, the definition of menopause is when it's been 1 year without a period. So again, that's really late in this season that we're talking about in perimenopause. So early in the perimenopause, a woman may notice simple things like her period comes a little bit sooner than she would have expected. So the cycles are shorter. Instead of maybe the 28 days, she might notice 25 days. And because this is basically a season where there's a lot of estrogen and not a lot of progesterone, that can manifest in anxiety and mood, irritability and mood symptoms that maybe weren't there before. She might have insomnia. Heavy periods are a common complaint. Weight gain, because later in the perimenopause, closer to menopause, so usually sometime in the 40s, late 40s for most, women will have trouble losing weight. It was easy before, and now it's harder because they're losing that estrogen, which helps manage our insulin levels. So the question is, what do we do about some of these symptoms? And really, it boils down to, just like we do everything in NaPro and everything, I think in good medicine, is we treat the overall health of the woman. So often women have been kind of getting by on not a lot of sleep, or a diet that has been maybe not very healthy. Maybe they're low in vitamin D. They might be a little iron deficient, and these things kind of exacerbate the symptoms that I mentioned earlier. So we as women, we are guilty of kind of not neglecting. Honestly, I see so many women that really are neglecting their health for good reasons, but you can't get away with that anymore in the last 10 years of your cycles, because those so many women will find out they have different autoimmune diseases that before maybe the symptoms were not there.
Fascinating. I was actually going to ask you, is this why so many women in their 40s and 50s find out that they are diabetic out of nowhere?
Yes.
So
yes.
Is it that they actually have diabetes, or that it's developed because insulin levels are changing and their diet is not conducive with that, and then after a couple of years that really throws their bodies off?
Yeah, I mean, that's a fascinating subject. So in medicine, we are not good at diagnosing the really early precursor symptoms of diabetes. We're good at diagnosing diabetes, but we're not good at diagnosing something called insulin resistance, which really presents as sometimes infertility. I see this all the time as a cause of infertility and recurrent miscarriage early on. And women who have this thing called gestational diabetes. So in pregnancy, so they think that they got out of pregnancy and now they're quote unquote fine. So no. That's the time to educate. Okay, we need to watch the carbs so that you don't get into diabetes in menopause. So
Right.
yeah, it's an early detection. We need more early detection of these things.
Now, where does histamine intolerance fall into this insulin resistance as well?
Yes, so I've learned a lot about perimenopause and this particular topic from a Dr. Laura, spelled Lara, Bryden, Briden. She wrote a book called The Hormone Repair Manual, which is all about perimenopause, and the Period Repair Manual. So everything I'm saying now, I really got from her. But there is a very important link between high estrogen levels that many women have and this thing called histamine excess or histamine intolerance as well.
Right.
And that can cause rashes, that can cause all kinds of irregularities in the cycle, gut
Or
issues.
even allergic reactions.
Allergic
that can make you
reactions.
More susceptible.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
I've struggled with insulin, and it's been interesting because people, my doctors have commented it surrounds food and this hormone irregularity that I experience surrounding, polycystic ovarian syndrome and thyroid, hyperthyroidism. So it's fascinating to see how much food impacts all of these phases in life, basically.
Yes. It's really important.
Yeah, it's actually just a fun fact, total side tangent. I know we're talking about perimenopause, but the histamine reaction has been a huge thing for me postpartum, and I didn't realize that was part of why I was so exhausted. It was a fact that I was more sensitive. It wasn't necessarily that I was eating bad things, but there are certain foods, if you're really histamine sensitive or intolerant at a certain point, such as avocados, that can be more problematic, that are high in histamines, that you think, oh, this is a great health food, but if you have a histamine issue, it could be causing crash and allergic reactions for a period of time.
Yes, and dairy, that's a big one too.
Yes. Yep.
Yes.
Okay, so as we're talking about this, what are things that people can do to address these symptoms when in that premenopausal transition area? And again, the warning signs, if you could just quickly reiterate them.
So trouble with weight, so trouble losing weight when maybe it's been easier before, heavy periods, irregular cycles, really new anxiety and new depression. And so the biggest ones I see are insomnia and heavy periods.
Okay.
So these are, again, first treated with good basic health care, checking vitamin levels, especially vitamin D and iron, getting your diet right. And then I treat a lot of these women with progesterone to counterbalance the high estrogen levels when otherwise they might end up on birth control, which furthers the insulin resistance and the mood problems, right? So we want to really avoid birth control. And then a lot of women lose their uterus because the doctor doesn't know what else to do other than birth control or hysterectomy, which is a shame because there's so much that can be done that's much more natural and really eases the transition as opposed to, kind of this dramatic, often it can exacerbate. Like if you take out someone's ovaries in the middle of their 40s, it can really put them on some kind of a spiral because they don't have still the benefits of those hormones they need.
Excellent. That actually will touch on a question we'll have coming up about having your ovaries removed. I know this is something that many women are advised when they have polycystic ovarian syndrome. Oh, if you think you're done having kids, or maybe you should just stop now, just have your ovaries removed and it'll fix everything with PCOS. So we'll touch on that question and your questions in just a little bit. Numbers 1-888-914-9149. We're going to come back discussing the ovarian cyst myth. If you have a question about fertility or infertility, Dr. Susan Caldwell is a specialist. Numbers 1-888-914-9149. We're also going to come back talking about tomorrow's saint, St. Maximilian Kolbe, August 14th, and the Assumption, the Blessed Virgin Mary, coming up on Sunday the 15th.
Bridging your Catholic faith with your everyday life. You're listening to Trending with Timmerie on Relevant Radio and the Relevant Radio app.
Coming up this weekend, the feast days of St. Maximilian Kolbe and the Assumption of the Blessed Virgin Mary into heaven. We'll talk about both of those coming up here on Trending. And now joining me is Dr. Susan Caldwell. She's a NaPro doctor, which is a specialist in fertility, infertility, women's health, If you're sick of being prescribed birth control, if you're sick of just this band-aid approach without treating underlying symptoms, Dr. Susan Caldwell, along with our other incredible NaPro doctors nationwide, are great resources. They're usually almost always Catholics. In fact, this was a response to the Pope Paul VI, back in the 60s, calling for Catholic medical professionals to help find solutions for women and couples. You can find her incredible work at that's Dr. Susan Caldwell, CALDWELL.com. We'll post the link in the show notes. You can subscribe and catch those in the podcast at relevantradio.com/trending. Dr. Caldwell, I'd like to dive into the topic of ovarian cysts and the myths, the common myths that so many women are truly put through the ringer over, from the fear and anxiety, the idea that they constantly have to be removed and surgery. What's normal, and where do people even start with this?
Okay, great. These are all good questions. So, women need to know that every month they have a normal follicle. Let's define some terms. So, a follicle is the little bubble, or I hate to call it a cyst, because a cyst is really a term that we use for a disease, an abnormality of the ovary. But it's I think of it as, when you see it on in surgery, it looks like a little bubble, like a child would play with and blow, and it would burst. It's very clear. You can kind of see through it. It looks like there's water inside. And that's a follicle that grows during the time the woman is having her period every month. There's a little follicle that grows and grows and grows, and eventually it ruptures naturally to release the egg at ovulation. So over about a 2-week span, but the reality is that follicle's actually been developing for about 90 to 100 days, but you won't really be able to see it until it's really almost at ovulation there in those 2 weeks. So, and a normal follicle should be about 2 centimeters in size. And so if you look at any woman, you will see at any given time, if you look at both of her ovaries, she will have multiple follicles that are in different stages of development that you might be able to see. In women with polycystic ovarian syndrome that is evident on the ovaries, it's going to look very filled with these follicles, lots and lots of follicles. So it's controversial among doctors what's a normal looking ovary on ultrasound, because there's so many variabilities of normal. So many women have follicles that and they have normal ovulation, they do great. So when you just take a snapshot of the ovary and you see these little follicles and or cysts, depending on they can be misdiagnosed. So if a woman goes into this happens all the time to my patients, they'll go into the emergency room with abdominal pain, and they do an ultrasound and they see what looks like a follicle, and they'll say, oh, it's just ovarian cysts. And they'll just blame her pain on what is a normal finding.
Right.
But when I've asked them later, I've talked to them about taking the time and said, okay, when was your period and what time of the cycle was that and what was going on? Recently, I had a patient who had kind of a significant type of, a gastroenteritis, so an infection of the lower abdominal, the colon, and she was having symptoms that were very typical for that. And they told her that she had an ovarian cyst and that she should get on birth control to prevent this from happening again.
Wow.
Which is terrible.
It is unacceptable.
Right. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And the woman didn't know anything about her body. Her mom didn't know who was with her didn't know anything about cycles. And so the ER doctor is in a hurry and sees something on the ultrasound that looks, kind of like a cyst or a follicle, and says, oh, that's what it is. Go see your OB. You need to go on birth control. Da, 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 da. And
it's just a lack of women's health and awareness. And what's just so frustrating to me, Dr. Caldwell, is that even many of our traditional OBGYNs are not meeting the needs of women because they are just prescribing birth control. And you think, well, I thought I went to a fertility specialist. I thought I went to a women's doctor. I thought I went to an OBGYN. But the reality is that so many women have their fertility impacted by the extreme decisions that are poor medical decisions that are being made for them.
Yes. Yes, it's really unfortunate. It's unfortunate, right?
So it sounds to me like the only solution is really to have a NaPro doctor that you're working with. Now, in the event that there isn't a NaPro doctor nearby, what are some questions you should be asking, and who should you reach out to work through this?
So for a woman, she should just be very hesitant to take any to operate out of fear. Because there is a fear of suffering, right? There is a fear, a distaste for this happening again. I don't want to end up in the emergency room. I don't want to, but often, out of haste, the doctor's in a hurry and the woman doesn't want to have pain again. There's this quick decision made to go on birth control. So just to wait and to ask lots of questions, okay, and then just to wait and see, and then to learn more about your body. So fertility awareness methods. So there's a post on my blog that I explain like different levels of fertility awareness. The basic level would be tracking your periods on an app. And then moving on from there, learning from different, natural womanhood and lots of fertility awareness methods out there, just more and more and more about the body, how to tell when you ovulate, so that if these things do happen, you can tell, okay, wait a second, I had just had my, I was ovulating at that time when I had this, because there are different cysts that can be treated. Like there's something called a follicular cyst that you can tell on the chart. There'll be a lot of mucus that will be maybe your ovulation will be delayed. There's something called a luteal cyst that shows a long luteal phase. These things can be treated very simply with progesterone, but again, that's with a NaPro doctor. But women just, I think, with more awareness and the refusal to take a quick, easy, one-size-fits-all approach, I think that's just a great first step. And then also, and then there are cysts, though, that are big and they're persistent. There's one in particular, that we see. It's often called a hemorrhagic cyst. That's often a symptom of endometriosis. And so that if anybody tells you, you have a cyst that looks like endometriosis, it's super important to press the brakes and seek out a NaPro surgeon at that point, because the worst thing that could happen is you let an unexperienced surgeon go in and remove maybe a whole ovary because they really don't know how to do the delicate surgery to remove parts of the ovary and preserve fertility.
Okay, we have so many questions coming in. We're actually going to talk about removing ovaries in just a minute. If you have a question, we'll try to squeeze you in. The number's 1-888-914-9149. First, Nancy's on the line from Chicago, and she has a question about diet. She said she's 42 years old, 6 children, and this sounds like her situation. Nancy, what is your question?
Hi, Doctor and Timmerie. Yes, diet related. So many of the symptoms you mentioned I've had or have. And at this point, I'm 42. I don't know if I'm going to have any more children. They're aged 21 to 1. And a diet. I've had success with low carb. I've also had success with clean carbs and, weightlifting versus running and things like that. How does one find out what is best? Because honestly, especially since having this last baby, nothing works. Whether I go low carb, whether I go clean carb, how can one see what might work best for them?
Yeah, that's such a good question, Nancy. You have to listen to your body. Okay, and you can't. I don't think it's a good idea for your weight to be the primary way that you're measuring your success, because that can be a little tricky. Because if you push yourself to the point where you're losing all this weight, you might not have the energy to care for your children, right? So to continue to change things up, more meat. You can. I think just continuing like you're doing to try things, but always ask the question: how does my gut feel? How am I sleeping? How's my energy level? Am I craving foods? Those kinds of questions, and not just am I seeing the scale move? Because you want to be super gentle with yourself. You want to make sure the sleep is super important. So a lot of women in our 40s find out that our sleep has not been good and we've gotten away with it for a long time. But if we're not getting enough sleep, or we have symptoms of sleep apnea, we're not breathing properly through our nose, breathing through our mouth, things like that, that is going to cause this cortisol imbalance. We're going to have lots of cortisol and we're not going to be able to lose weight. So look at outside the box. Ask maybe what your vitamin D level is. See what your response is to gluten. You might want to go gluten-free, or you might want to even try a Whole30, because you might have some inflammation from dairy or some other things. And I know it can sound daunting, and you don't want to, you've got to take care of your family. You don't want to just spend all your energy thinking about your diet, but it's gentle and you have time. There's no rush, but this is all about helping you to be able to thrive and to serve who God has put in your life.
Amen. And I just want to remind people that you can find a NaPro doctor or a fertility specialist. Our fertility specialists do telemedicine. They're great. They're personal. They help dive in to everything that's going on. We're posting a link on social media. It's also my link tree on Instagram. So be sure to check that out. It'll be in the podcast notes for today. We have Elaine calling from Illinois as well. She has a question about her 19-year-old daughter who it looks like had an ovarian cyst removed. Elena, what's your question?
Hi, thank you so much for taking my call, Timmerie and Doctor. And Doctor, the story you gave about the woman who went to the ER is my daughter's story. I had actually taken her to an NaPro doctor, and they had given her extra factors. But one time the pain was just so terrible that she ended up in the ER. She was sent to an OB-GYN. She took her birth control last July. She took it all the way to February. She stopped it in February, and she hasn't had a period since.
Yeah.
So what do you suggest we do?
Right. Gosh, that's tough, because the question is why, right? So you want to the question is, why is she not having a period? Yes, birth control can certainly disrupt ovulation. And that's a question. But if you just have recourse to your OB-GYN, you want to make sure that there's nothing else going on with your daughter. Has she lost a lot of weight? Is she under a lot of stress? All those things that you as a mom can kind of sort out. And then oftentimes what helps is to have maybe a 10-day course of progesterone. Often will kind of remind the brain, the hypothalamus and the pituitary to have a period, because often after birth control, the ovaries, everything will just go to sleep. Those organs, in the brain and the ovaries, will just kind of just go dormant. And then they won't just wake up on their own sometimes. So sometimes just, a round of progesterone ideally would be prometrium, or natural progesterone would honestly be the best, but most give a form of progesterone called Provera, which would be okay, but not the best. And that might help to restart those periods. Yeah, but it definitely needs to be looked into for sure.
Excellent. And I just want to let people know, perhaps you can't find a NaPro doctor near you. There are many across the nation, along with fertility care practitioners. We post a link on social media, but there are also NaPro doctors who do telemedicine. I know not everyone's a fan of telemedicine, but I do highly recommend our NaPro doctors are truly the only ones out there who are specialists in treating a lot of these underlying health concerns. They're not going to prescribe birth control, and they're going to actually help fix the damage that has been done by birth control to create a quick fix that isn't treating the underlying problem, which if you don't treat the underlying problem, I just want to emphasize, this is impacting women's fertility long term. We have a lot more questions coming in, but one that I want to make sure we cover, Dr. Caldwell, is what about having your ovaries removed? This has been something that's been recommended to many women when it comes to polycystic ovarian syndrome. We know that the church explicitly, if there's no other option, perhaps, but really recommends against this in particular, because it has to do with no longer being open to human life. But can you talk about it from a medical perspective?
Yeah, I just think that's not even that's not acceptable. For treatment of polycystic ovarian syndrome, that's not even an acceptable treatment. If the ovaries are large and that is interfering with ovulation, there is a technique which is so effective called the ovarian wedge resection that is done by the NaPro trained doctors. This is a very successful procedure. Basically, they debulk or they make the ovary smaller and more efficient surgically. And these women often go into regular cycles after that procedure is done. So I can't imagine removing the ovaries to treat that condition at all. It just doesn't sound right at all.
Excellent. Thank you so much for your help, your resources, Dr. Caldwell. If you've not followed her, she is practicing in New Orleans. You can find her at drsusancaldwell.com. That's drsusancaldwell.com. We'll post a link to her and also ways to find other NaPro doctors either in your area or via telemedicine in the show notes for today's show at relevantradio.com/trending, where you can subscribe, share this podcast with someone you know. Fertility, infertility is on the rise. We need to have this incredible resource, and this resource is Catholic, so not a lot of people have it, so be sure to share it. I'll be right back. Catholic Order of Foresters is proud to sponsor the Relevant Radio studio line. For information about employment opportunities and flexible premium life insurance plans, visit relevantradio.com/forester.
So, what's trending? Bridging your Catholic faith with your everyday life. You're listening to Trending with Timmerie on Relevant Radio and the Relevant Radio app.
Just a moment, we'll discuss St. Maximilian Kolbe and the Feast of the Assumption of the Blessed Virgin Mary, both feasts coming up this weekend. But there's one question I still want to touch on, and if we didn't get to your question, we will save these questions, some of which to be answered next week or next time Dr. Caldwell is with us. But Ola asked on Instagram, with a rise in infertility, will IVF, that is in vitro fertilization, ever be allowed in the church? This is a great question, and it starts by recognizing that the church doesn't change her teaching on things. And it's very important that we understand that. In vitro fertilization, in and of itself, is actually an intrinsic evil for multiple reasons. And the church will never change its teaching on this. Number one, because in vitro fertilization nearly always includes abortion in the process, because multiple babies, or multiple so-called embryos, right, just a baby in early stage of life, multiple babies, new human lives, are created through the in vitro fertilization process. Now, either all of them are implanted or some of them are frozen, some of them are implanted. What happens is this is a hostile environment often for babies because we know either a surrogate's present or there already wasn't a conducive environment for the baby, and so often a lot of these babies die, and it's very negligent, which is part of the reason why they implant so many. But then also what happens is, for example, you may remember the case of Octomom. Multiple babies will develop and continue into gestation. So the question often comes up of, how many do you want? Well, usually a couple or a single only wants one or two babies at most. And so all the other babies are aborted in the in vitro IVF fertilization process. Aborted. Babies are killed in the process. They call this selective reduction. Selective reduction is abortion in the IVF process. In fact, they're even going so far as to have this consumer baby mentality, this perfect baby mentality, trying to choose the best possible DNA and genetic makeup for which embryos they'll keep and which ones they'll get rid of. That, my friends, is the same as what so many people, such as Margaret Sanger, to those who were leaders in the World War II movement in Nazi Germany. That's eugenics at the end of the day. And that's what people are doing with in vitro fertilization. In addition to that, it disrespects the union of a husband and wife and the creation of new human life. It's incredibly damaging and outright damning for the woman's body, quite frankly. And Dr. Susan Caldwell has actually spoken and shared her testimony about this as well, which we'll post. I don't have a long time to go into this today, but we'll post it in the podcast notes for today's show. If you did not hear her testimony, you need to hear it. This is an episode you don't want to miss. You want to share with other people who are considering in vitro fertilization, or maybe you're struggling with fertility, because they need this message, these answers, and these other solutions such as NaPro technology. So check out relevantradio.com/trending. When the podcast goes up this evening, we'll be sure to include a link to that episode in the show notes. Great questions. So tomorrow is the feast day of St. Maximilian Kolbe. If you don't know a lot about him, he died during World War II. He died in Auschwitz, and he actually died on the eve of the Feast of the Assumption. If you know a little bit about Auschwitz, anytime one of the prisoners would escape, the rule was that for every prisoner that escaped, 10 would die. 10 would be killed. Now, Father Maximilian Kolbe, St. Maximilian Kolbe, saw as one man was chosen, one of 10, to be killed for someone who had escaped. And the man starts to plead, talking about his spouse and his children, his responsibilities. Father Kolbe then steps up and says to take him instead, and ends up saving the man's life. He actually ended up surviving and making it out of Auschwitz, shockingly, by the grace of Lord and Father Kolbe's sacrifice, and was able to write about this story. Now, St. Maximilian Kolbe, though, just imagine what he had to have in terms of a faith to be able to endure Auschwitz, to go through World War II. I mean, here was a saint who literally would house thousands, when I say thousands, of Jews into his church during World War II, trying to save them and protect them from the Gestapo, from the Nazis. This is, I mean, his story is profound, and ultimately he ends up being captured. You shouldn't be surprised. He was preaching in the name of Christ and saving people from the physical harm of the Nazis. And so here this man was, he ends up being arrested. He dies at Auschwitz, but he would actually go throughout the night after being tortured, deprived of food, and he would walk around as the men were sleeping and women, and he would offer them confession, offer them anointing of the sick. He would hear their confessions and care for them in this horrible time of torture and slaughter. St. Maximilian Kolbe then, when he ends up being locked in a room with 9 other men to die for one man who had escaped, he and those in the room with him would sing and sing and sing, and they would last days and days on end. And it was very slow and painstakingly that the people would die one at a time, but they would die with the praise and songs of our Lord on their lips. The very last one was St. Maximilian Kolbe. He out-survived all of them, and finally it was determined he had lived too long, it had gone on too long, they'd been locked in there for so long. In fact, when they go to empty the barrels of urine, there was no urine. And this is how intense it was for them. St. Maximilian Kolbe and the other 9 that were locked in this room to die and be tortured were literally drinking their own urine just to help them survive for nourishment. Finally, it's just Father Kolbe left, and they determine it's gone on too long, and they end up giving him an injection to die. And he died on the eve of the Assumption of the Blessed Virgin Mary. Why is all of this significant? Why are we talking about? Well, one, it's his feast day, tomorrow, the 14th of August. And right on the kind of approaching the Assumption. And I just ponder for a moment, how on earth did St. Maximilian Kolbe have this type of faith to make it through Auschwitz, to go after being tortured and to walk around to the prisoners offering confession, anointing the sick, praying with them, and then to be tortured in a room at Auschwitz with 9 others and to be singing, and for them to live days upon days upon days on end, longer than any other prisoners would. And then for him to be the last one, and for him, they'd say that as the other prisoners were struggling, they were on the ground, he would be kneeling or standing in the middle of them, praying over them, praying with them, singing. How on earth did he have this kind of faith? Well, we know that St. Maximilian Kolbe had an incredible devotion to the intercession of the Blessed Virgin Mary. In fact, we know that St. Maximilian Kolbe founded the Immaculata Militia, which was a group all over Rome, all over. In fact, there are still groups to this day who are devoted to the Immaculata, devoted to the Blessed Virgin Mary. And so let's pray on the eve of his feast day, on the double eve of the Assumption of the Blessed Virgin Mary into heaven, that we pray to the Immaculata, the Queen of heaven and earth. As St. Maximilian, in one of his prayers, a consecration prayer, wrote, that we pray to the refuge of sinners and our most loving Mother, God, who is willed to entrust the entire order of mercy to you, that I, a repentant sinner, cast myself at your feet, humbly imploring you to take me with all that I am and have, wholly to yourself as your possession and property. I wish I could pray this whole prayer with you now, but think of the faith of St. Maximilian Kolbe. But then think about the fact that the Assumption was understood and already a living tradition in Spain in 312, which is far away from where the Blessed Virgin Mary would have assumed into heaven. That this was a part of the living tradition of the church for years passed on. And that finally in 1950, not even 100 years ago, the Assumption was formally proclaimed. Why is this significant? I think the church knew that you and I needed a model of humanity that was perfected by God's grace to show us that we can too be taken up to heaven with God, that we too are meant to be at his side, and that Our Lady is a profound intercessor, but human nature can be elevated by the grace of God to be united with him. Turn to Our Lady, make her your model, and celebrate her this weekend.